The door slammed shut with such a crash, as if cutting off the last hope. The woman stood on the threshold of someone else's house, holding two children by the hands. Snow was falling in large flakes, settling on their shoulders and hair. The frost bit at their faces, crept under their clothes. Behind her, the last door in the village had slammed shut. Marina was driven out in winter. In the middle of the fiercest frosts, when snow lay knee-deep and the cold penetrated to the bone. She was driven out together with two children, her niece and nephew, whom she had taken in after her sister's death. 8-year-old Sasha and 10-year-old Katia stood nearby, pressing against their aunt, trembling from cold and fear. They had gone around the entire village. Marina knocked on every door, begged to be sheltered for at least a week, promised to work, sew, cook, do anything. People shook their heads, turned away, closed doors right in front of her nose. The winter was harsh, supplies were scarce. No one wanted an extra mouth to feed. No one wanted to share warmth and food with strange children and a single woman who could offer nothing valuable in return. The old man at the last house in the village looked at Marina with cold eyes and said what everyone else was thinking but feared to say aloud. Let her go into the forest. Let her do what she wants. But there's no place for her here. There's no place for the weak here. Marina looked at the children, at their frightened faces, at their trembling lips, at their eyes full of silent questions. Then she turned around and led them away from the village to where the houses ended and the forest began. She didn't know what to do, didn't know how to protect the children from winter, which was only beginning and promised to be long and merciless. But she knew one thing. She couldn't give up. To stop meant to die. On the outskirts of the village, where the forest began, Marina found a small clearing among tall fir trees. The snow lay here in a thick layer, but the wind was slightly weaker. The trees provided at least some protection from the piercing gusts. The ground beneath the snow was frozen, hard as stone. The woman seated the children by a fire she had made from dry branches found under the snow. She wrapped them in the only blanket, pressed them together so they could warm each other with the heat of their bodies. Then she took an old shovel, rusty, with a crack in the handle, found by an abandoned barn at the edge of the village. Marina began to dig. The ground was hard as iron. The frost had penetrated deep, turning the soil into a monolith that wouldn't yield to the shovel. The tool rang with each strike, the vibration reverberating through her hands, her fingers going numb from cold and strain. Her back ached, her muscles burned, her breathing became ragged. But the woman continued, strike after strike, centimeter by centimeter, as if breaking a path through stone to salvation. Katia and Sasha sat by the fire, silently watching their aunt gnaw into the frozen earth. Sometimes they approached, tried to help with their small hands, but Marina gestured for them to go back to the fire. They couldn't be allowed to freeze. They needed to preserve their strength. The children gathered branches for the fire, breaking off dry twigs from the lower branches of fir trees. They brought snow in a pot to melt it over the fire and get water. They warmed themselves, huddled together, covered with the blanket. They didn't cry, didn't complain, didn't ask what would happen next. They simply waited, trusting the only adult who remained with them. Marina dug during the day, when the sun at least slightly warmed the air and gave faint hope that the ground would become softer. She dug in the evening, when twilight thickened and the cold grew stronger. She dug even at night, by the light of the fire, when the frost eased slightly and the top layer of earth became more pliable. Her hands became covered with bloody blisters that burst and bled. Her fingers went so numb they barely obeyed. Her nails broke, her skin cracked from the cold. But she didn't stop. There was little time. Each night, spent in the open air, could be the last. Each hour of delay brought them closer to freezing. The children were already beginning to cough in the mornings. Their lips turned blue from cold even by the fire. After 3 days of continuous work, the pit became deep enough, 1 meter deep, 2 meters long, 1.5 meters wide. The size was small, but Marina couldn't dig more. Her strength was running out, and there was no time. She dug an entrance on one side, making it low and narrow so the cold wouldn't penetrate inside in streams. She reinforced the walls with branches and poles found in the forest, weaving them together, creating a kind of framework. She lined this framework with a thick layer of moss, which she collected from the north side of trees, and dry grass, which she found under the snow. On top, She covered the pit with thick fir branches, laying them in a dense layer. Then another layer of moss. Then earth, which she had dug from the pit. Then snow, tamping it down with her hands, creating an additional barrier against the cold. The result was a dugout, low, cramped, barely accommodating 3 people, more like an animal's burrow than a dwelling. But it was protected from wind and frost. Inside, the woman began to build a stove. She collected stones by the stream, which hadn't completely frozen yet. She found clay there too, under a layer of ice. The clay was frozen, hard, uncooperative. Marina warmed it by the fire, heated it between her palms, kneaded it with her fingers until it became soft. Then she molded something like a hearth from it, joining the stones together with clay mortar. The work was crude, primitive, far from perfect. But the stove held. The smoke was supposed to exit through a narrow pipe, which Marina made from hollow branches, coating them with clay on the outside. She led the pipe through the roof of the dugout, reinforced it with stones, lined it with moss. When everything was ready, the woman lit a fire inside. Inside the dugout it was dark and smelled of earth, dampness, smoke. The ceiling was so low that an adult couldn't straighten up to full height. The walls were uneven, earthen, cold to the touch. The floor was packed earth, covered with a thin layer of dry grass. But when the fire blazed in the stove, a miracle happened. It became warm. Amazingly, incredibly, savingly warm. The earth began to heat up, absorbing the warmth from the stove and giving it back into the space of the dugout. The walls, covered with a thick layer of snow, moss, and branches, didn't let the cold in from outside. The narrow and low entrance didn't allow the wind to penetrate inside, creating a natural airlock. The air was stuffy, heavy, smelling of smoke and dampness. But it was warm. So warm that they could remove their outer clothing and not shiver. Katya and Sasha climbed inside, squeezing through the narrow entrance, and froze, feeling the warmth. For the first time in many days, for the first time since they had been driven from the last house, their bodies stopped shivering from cold. They pressed against their aunt, covered themselves with the blanket, curled up in a ball on the floor of the dugout. Marina embraced the children, pressing their small, thin bodies to herself, feeling how the tension slowly left, how breathing became more even, how fear retreated. Katya buried her face in her shoulder and quietly sobbed, not from grief, but from relief. Sasha held tightly to her hand, not letting go even when he fell asleep. That night they slept for the first time in a long while. Slept without fear of freezing, without the need to wake up every hour to throw wood into the fire. The earth kept their warmth, sheltered them, protected them. Days turned into weeks. Marina developed a strict routine. She rose at dawn, when the first rays of sun began to break through the trees. She lit the stove, using coals that had smoldered all night. She cooked thin porridge from the remains of grain, the very grain she had managed to trade for her last copper coins before they were driven out. There was very little grain. Marina measured it out in handfuls, stretching the supplies with all her might. 1 handful per day for 3. The porridge came out watery, almost transparent, but hot. The children ate silently, licking the pot to the last drop. After breakfast, the woman went into the forest. She gathered brushwood, breaking dry branches from trees, digging them out from under the snow. She dragged bundles of firewood to the dugout, stacking them in the far corner where it was drier. She set primitive snares for hares, using thin rope and flexible branches. She searched for edible roots under the snow, burdock, dandelion roots, wild sorrel, anything that could provide at least some nutrients. The children helped as they could, and their help was invaluable. Katya learned to tend the stove, to add wood little by little so the fire wouldn't burn out too quickly and wouldn't go out. She saved every chip, every log, understanding that supplies were limited. The girl also cooked, melted snow for water, reheated food when Marina returned from the forest. Sasha hauled water from the stream, which flowed several hundred paces from the dugout. The stream hadn't frozen completely yet. Water flowed under a crust of ice, and the boy learned to break through this ice with a stick, scoop water with a pot, carry it back, trying not to spill. He also gathered dry branches for kindling, broke them off from the lower parts of fir trees, stacked them in a pile by the entrance to the dugout. They worked silently, seriously, like adults. In a few weeks, the children had aged years. The childish carefreeness, naivety, belief that adults would fix everything, all disappeared. Katia became quieter, more attentive, learned to anticipate the needs of her younger brother, cared for him like a mother. Sasha stopped crying at night, stopped complaining about hunger and cold, learned to endure pain and fatigue silently, clenching his teeth. They survived. Each day was a struggle, each evening a small victory. Food was catastrophically scarce. Marina divided each piece into 3 parts, measuring portions with jeweler's precision. She made sure the children ate their share completely, while she made do with leftovers. Sometimes she managed to catch a hare in the snares. Then it was a real celebration. Marina butchered the carcass, not losing a single gram of meat. She cooked real soup, thick, rich, hot. The children ate slowly, savoring each piece, knowing this wouldn't happen again soon. The woman didn't throw away the rabbit skins. She dried them over the stove, then sewed them together, creating an additional blanket. She used the bones for broth, boiling them several times until they became soft. At night, when the children fell asleep, huddled together under rabbit skins, Marina lay and listened to the sounds outside. The howling of wind that swept over the clearing but couldn't break into the dugout. The cracking of trees from frost, sharp, like a gunshot. The quiet crackling of coals in the stove, steady and soothing. The breathing of children nearby, measured, calm, alive. She thought about how it could have been different. What if people had been kinder, the world more just, if someone had extended a helping hand instead of slamming a door? But these thoughts didn't warm or help. What warmed was the earth, the fire she maintained in the stove, the determination not to give up while blood flowed in her veins. The village lived its usual life, not knowing and not caring about the fate of Marina and the children. People heated their stoves, cooked food, slept in warm houses, covered with thick blankets. Some said the woman with children had probably frozen in the first week. How could one survive in the forest in winter without a house? Some thought they had gone to another village, found shelter there. No one checked. No one particularly cared. Life went on, and Marina continued to fight for existence, for each new day. She learned much during those weeks. She learned to butcher prey so as not to lose a drop of blood, not a piece of meat. She learned to make traps from branches, ropes, and stones, to place them in places where animals left tracks. She learned to find edible roots even under a thick layer of snow and ice, digging the earth with frozen fingers. She learned to determine by the look of a tree where to look for dry branches, how to break them properly so as not to waste strength in vain. She learned to conserve. Every crumb of food, every chip of firewood, every drop of water. Nothing went to waste. Everything was put to use. The children grew thinner. Their faces became gaunt. Their eyes grew larger. Their cheekbones protruded. Clothes hung on them like sacks. But they didn't get sick. Marina monitored this with fanatical persistence. The children were always warm, always ate at least once a day, always slept covered and dry. She checked every evening. Was there a cough? Was there a fever? Were there signs of frostbite on their fingers? One night, in the middle of winter, came a frost of such strength that even the old-timers couldn't remember. Trees in the forest cracked from the cold with a loud crack, like rifle shots. The air burned the lungs, even on inhalation, turning breathing into torture. The snow squeaked underfoot as if walking on broken glass. Marina woke up when the cold began to seep through the entrance to the dugout, like a living creature, like an invisible snake. She quickly rose, threw a whole armful of wood into the stove. There was no time to economize. She closed the entrance with additional rabbit skins, plugged all the cracks with moss and grass. She pressed the children to herself more tightly, covered them with all the blankets they had. Katia woke from the movement, opened her eyes fearfully, looked at her aunt. In her gaze was a question, but she didn't say a word. Marina pressed her to herself, stroked her head, and the girl closed her eyes again, trusting. In the morning, when the woman got outside, the world seemed alien. The frost was so strong that even the smoke from the dugout's chimney didn't rise upward. It froze in the air, turning into tiny ice crystals that fell back to the ground like snow. Trees were covered with a thick layer of frost, sparkling in the sun. The earth had turned into an iron crust. But inside the dugout it was warm. The earth continued to hold the heat accumulated over weeks, didn't release it into the frosty air. The stove warmed the small space, and that was enough. And in the village, real troubles began, which Marina would learn about later. The frost struck so hard that the wells froze. Water turned into a solid monolith of ice at a depth of several meters. People tried to chop the ice with axes, pounded for hours until their hands began to bleed. They had to drag snow into their homes in whole sacks, melted over stoves, getting pitiful liters of water. Firewood ran out at a frightening rate. Houses in the village were built for beauty and status, not for retaining heat. High ceilings, wide windows, thick logs. All this looked impressive but poorly retained warmth. Heat escaped through cracks between logs, through windows, through the roof. Cold roamed through the houses, chilled the corners, penetrated under blankets. From the terrible frost, the logs in the walls began to crack. They split with a loud crack, leaving gaps through which the wind whistled. Windows became covered with a thick layer of ice from the inside. People couldn't melt it even with their breath. In some houses, water in buckets froze right inside the house. The old people began to fall ill first. A cough that wouldn't stop at night. Fever that shook the whole body. Weakness that confined them to bed. Children also coughed, gasped, cried from chest pain. Several people didn't survive that winter. They froze in their own homes, despite stoves and firewood. The cold proved stronger. And in the dugout on the edge of the forest, 3 people slept peacefully, covered by earth and protected by a primitive stove made of stones and clay. Marina continued to rise every morning, continued to maintain the fire, continued to feed the children, continued to fight. Winter dragged on endlessly, like a curse. It seemed it would never end. But Marina didn't give up. Every morning she rose, lit the fire, fed the children with the little she managed to find or catch. She went into the forest for firewood and food, returned with frozen hands and feet, but with firewood and prey. Every evening, she put Katia and Sasha to bed, covered them with rabbit skins and the only blanket, pressed them to herself, sharing the warmth of her body. And every night, lying in the darkness, listening to the children's breathing and the crackling of coals, she thanked the earth for keeping them, protecting them, warming them. Spring came slowly, reluctantly, as if not daring to claim its rights. Snow began to melt only at the end of March, turning into dirty gray slush. Streams gurgled louder, freeing themselves from ice. Birds returned from warm lands, filling the air with singing and chirping. The first grass broke through the melted snow, bright, green, alive. Marina emerged from the dugout and stood by the entrance, straightening to full height for the first time in many months. She inhaled the fresh spring air. It smelled of melt water, earth, young foliage. Katia and Sasha stood nearby, squinting from the bright sun, to which they had grown unaccustomed during the long months spent in the semi-darkness of the dugout. They had survived, the 3 of them, without help, without support, against all odds. A few days after the thaw began, a woman from the village came to the forest. She walked slowly, warily, looking around as if afraid of getting lost in familiar places. She saw Marina standing by the entrance to the dugout and stopped, as if seeing a ghost. The woman looked, not believing her eyes. Before her stood Marina, thin, exhausted, aged several years over the winter, but alive. And next to her, 2 children, just as thin, with large eyes and gaunt faces, but alive. The visitor looked at the dugout, at the low mound of earth covered with remnants of snow and moss, at the narrow entrance draped with skins, at the thin stream of smoke rising from the chimney, at this pitiful shelter, which resembled an animal's burrow more than a house, and couldn't say a word. Finally, the woman found her voice. She said that the entire village had been certain. Marina and the children had perished in the very first week. That it was impossible to survive in the forest in winter in a dugout, without a real house, without supplies, without help. That everyone had considered it madness. She told about how hard it had been for the village, how houses cracked from the frost, how wells froze, how firewood ran out, how the old people and children fell ill, how several people didn't survive that winter, despite warm houses and stoves. And this woman had dug a hole in the ground and survived, saved children in a burrow when people were dying in houses. The visitor stood a bit longer, looking at Marina with something like reverence and shame at the same time, then turned and walked back to the village. News that Marina and the children were alive spread through the village with the speed of a forest fire. People no longer laughed at the mad woman who had gone into the forest, no longer said she was doomed. Some came to look at the dugout, came quietly, timidly, almost shamefully. They looked at the low mound of earth, almost indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape, at the narrow entrance through which an adult could pass only by bending over, at the primitive stove built of stones, at rabbit skins instead of blankets, at the minimum of things on which 3 people had survived an entire winter. They looked and were silent. They understood that this woman had accomplished the impossible, that she had dug a house in frozen earth with bare, bloody hands, that she had warmed children with the heat of her determination when the whole world had turned away, that she had survived not thanks to help, but despite the refusal of it. One of the men offered Marina to return to the village, said he could rent out a corner in his house, that now everything would be different, that people had understood their mistake. Marina looked at him with a long, calm gaze, then slowly shook her head. She thanked him for the offer, but refused. She said she would stay here until she found her own place, a place that no one could take from her. The man nodded, understanding that further persuasion was pointless. Marina remained in the dugout until midsummer. During this time, she reinforced and expanded it, making it more spacious and comfortable. Katia and Sasha helped, learned to build, repair, create something from almost nothing. Learn not to depend on other people's mercy. In summer, the woman found work in a neighboring village. She sewed clothes to order, repaired old things, altered large items into small ones. She worked hard, sparing no effort, saving every penny. By the end of summer, she had saved enough to buy a plot of land and begin building a real house. Small, simple, but her own. No one could drive them out of it. No one could slam a door in their face. The children carried logs, those they could lift. They needed clay for coating the walls. They helped build the stove, passing stones and bricks. They learned from their mother patience, perseverance, the ability not to give up. By autumn, the house was ready. A small cabin with 1 room, a low ceiling and small windows, but with a strong stove, solid walls, and a reliable roof. But Marina didn't fill in or destroy the dugout. She left it as it was, as a memory of the winter they had survived, of the strength they found in themselves when it seemed there was no strength left, of the earth that had kept their warmth and life when the whole world had turned away and slammed doors. Sometimes, on warm summer evenings, Marina came to the dugout, sat nearby on the grass, and just sat, remembering. Katia and Sasha sometimes came with her, sat silently nearby. They never spoke of it aloud, but all 3 knew that winter had changed them forever, hardened them, taught them what no books or teachers could teach. It taught them that you can survive when everything is against you. That warmth is not in high walls and rich houses, but in the determination not to give up. That the earth can become a home if you're ready to fight for each day, for each breath, for each crumb of life. Katia and Sasha grew, became stronger, wiser, more confident. They remembered that winter forever, not as a nightmare they wanted to forget, but as a lesson that needed to be remembered. Years later, when the children had grown, learned trades and settled in their own homes, created their own families, they sometimes returned to that clearing on the edge of the forest. There, under a thick layer of grass, moss and fallen leaves, one could still make out the outlines of the old dugout. The entrance had long been overgrown. The stove had collapsed, but the shape remained, a small mound, slightly different from the surrounding space. They stood there, each with their own thoughts, remembering the woman who hadn't been afraid, hadn't broken, hadn't abandoned them to fate, who had dug a house in frozen earth with bloody hands, who had warmed them not with a stove, but with her love and unbending will to live. And they thanked her, mentally, silently, for teaching them the most important thing. It's not the strongest or richest who survive, but those who don't give up even when giving up seems the only reasonable choice.